Welcome to a conversation with Steven Pinker. This is a bit of a thrill and a challenge for me. When the organizers asked if there was anyone in the whole week I particularly would like to speak with, I had no hesitation in requesting just this sit down. I've been a great fan of Steven's work ever since The Language Instinct, which I still consider one of the best nonfiction books I've ever read. But since that, Promethean, and I think canonical work in linguistics, he has branched out to produce a work of astonishing breadth. The best shorthand description, and it's not so short, on your website is experimental psychologist who's interested in all aspects of language and mind. Though I think that's under-inclusive because he is also, at a minimum, an important political philosopher and cultural critic. A more compact description, but a title I think he would not welcome is, he's among our greatest public intellectuals. Author of 13 books, including The Language Instinct, The Blank Slate, The Sense of Style, Words and Rules, which to my mind belongs up there in the Pinker canon, and then his most recent series of books that are especially panoramic in span The Better Angels of Our Nature, which conference participant Bill Gates called the most inspiring book he'd ever read. That is until Enlightenment Now, which he called his new favorite book of all time. Most recently, Rationality, and coming in the fall, I hope we have a minute at the end to discuss it, a new book. Well, we'll save the title for then. So given his many important works, as well as trenchant public commentary on current events, like the demonstrations at Harvard around the Gaza war, 45 minutes can barely scratch the surface. But I'm going to give him my best shot. Steven Pinker, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Harry.
I wanted to start with a couple personal questions that were new to me before we get to your work. So you grew up in this, I think of it as a storied Montreal Jewish community that deserves its own book almost for the leaders and thinkers it produced. Leonard Cohen and Mordechai Richter, Sorda Saul Bellow, the Bronfman family. And I've blown the lead for backstage when we were talking, but my father-in-law, a prominent physicist there, and Steven's mother grew up on both at 4057 Gray Avenue, atop and bottom of the same community. So, but it seems like a very important, interesting place in and of itself. How do you think that community shaped you?
Oh, well, it was a minority within a minority within a minority. So the Jewish community within the Anglophone community within the French province within the predominantly Anglo country of Canada. It was my community, the Jewish community of Montreal, came kind of a generation later than the big wave of immigration to the United States. My four grandparents all arrived in Canada in the late 20s, and I can only infer that that was after the United States had shut the door on immigration. In 1924, there was a restrictive immigration law, and I can just imagine them, back in Poland and Moldova thinking, oh, geez, we can't get to New York, damn it. Where can we go? Should we go to Argentina? Should we go to Palestine? Should we go to China? And there's this place, Montreal, not so far from New York. It's cold, but we're used to that here in Poland.
Right.
And I think, thank you, Bubby, thank you, Zadie, for going to Montreal. So the community was a generation later, and it sort of had, I think, some of the ambition, the solidarity of the kind of classic New York Jewish community of also highly accomplished, of many writers and entertainers and scientists, but a generation later. And so sort of the heyday came after the peak of the well-known New York Jewish intellectual community.
Yeah. Flash forward about another 20 years, because you've indicated, you've cited the strong personal influence of what I think we still call classic rock, what my kids call dad music. It's what I listen to as well. But it does feel, Stephen, as if the songs that it's not just they were playing on the radio when you were young, more a part of a kind of developing identity. Is that fair? And if you can share who, in the list of the power bands, who are your sort of top 2 or 3, but what influence do you see in your own development?
I am gratified. So I'm torn when I think back of that era. 'Cause on the one hand, I think, well, every generation thinks that the music of their youth was the best of all time. But in this case, I have students, 19-year-olds, who say, "Wow, I just bought this fantastic album. Have you heard of Simon and Garfunkel Bookends?"
Exactly.
And I think that I think art forms really do have heydays. We're just no one's going to write an opera anymore of the Verdi Puccini era or a Broadway musical of the Cole Porter era. And I think probably rock did have its heyday from probably the 60s through the 90s. At least, and a number of my students say, our music sucks. It must have been really good to listen in your era. Now, I have a kind of a mixed reaction to it because it was truly great music, but a lot of the underlying mindset was I could never really completely get behind. It was kind of, it was kind of jejune. It was authority is illegitimate, rebellion is good, acting on your impulses and your emotions is good. And I somewhat, I guess, seditiously, with respect to my own generation, in The Better Angels of Our Nature, I tried to explain something that criminologists are still puzzling over, which is why the violent crime rate shot up in the 1960s and stayed high until the early 1990s. Now,
when it actually kind of plummeted, impressively,
Well, impressively, but why, if you look at rates of violent
It's all the
crime,
Rolling Stones, I guess.
Well, the thing is, I think there's actually maybe a little bit to that, in that part of it is just demographics. This is when the baby boom generation, baby boomers entered their crime-prone years, like 15 to 30. But it's not just that, because if you just look at typical crime rates of different ages and then multiply by the demographic composition of the population, that would explain why the crime rate should have increased by about 15%, but in fact it increased by 200%. So partly it was that we kind of overwhelmed the existing criminal justice system, but there was also an ethos of disrespect for self-control, for authority, for delay of gratification. If it feels good, do it was one of the lapel buttons that we used to wear. Do it till you're satisfied. That kind of idea that emotional impulses were good, and it reversed. The reason that I brought it up, I mean, it's kind of amateur sociology to say that the kind of anarchic impulse of the 1960s included a enabling of violent crime. But it was a reversal of a centuries-old process that called the civilizing process, a theory from German sociologist Norbert Elias, that from the Middle Ages to modernity, one of the sweeping cultural changes was valorization of decorum, of following rules, of inhibiting your impulses, of delaying gratification. The medievals were kind of gross. I mean, they would pee in the corner and have sex in public and blow their nose into their hands at the dinner table. So the whole centuries-long process of propriety kind of got reversed in the 60s deliberately. And so even though I grooved on the music, as we used to say, but there's some part of me that always resisted that anarchic philosophy.
Yeah, and I do think it's had legs, as it were. I think year in, year out, the biggest selling band out there is the Beatles. It's still today. Okay, so thanks. Let's move to your work, please. So you mentioned Better Angels of Our Nature and that, and maybe Enlightenment Now, certainly Rationality. you've developed a reputation as, if not an optimist, which is a label you reject, an advocate of something like the view that in the long sweep of history, we are overall advancing upwards, if jaggedly upwards, in health, safety, knowledge, and it's an overall pretty good arc and story. Now, critics, though, point to rising inequality and ecological challenges and terrorism and slippages in democracy and more to say, nah, the arrow of history is actually pointing jaggedly down. So what's your response to people who argue that your historical worldview is basically starry-eyed?
Yeah, well, it's, I do reject the label of an optimist, although probably by personality I probably am, but I try to discount that because why should my personality, the particular genes I inherited from my father, have anything to do with the state of the world? So if I do have that temperament, it's kind of something I try to repress. No, so I myself kind of stumbled on the fact of human progress just by looking at graphs which surprised even me. In particular, what prompted me to write The Better Angels of Our Nature was coming across graphs for a number of people killed in wars, which kind of went not steadily, but bumpily downward since 1946. Rates of violence against women, including sexual assault, plummeted since the early 1970s. The great American crime decline starting in the early 1990s. Rates of child abuse had gone down. Rates of homicide had plunged since the Middle Ages. And I just realized there seems to be a pattern here which most people don't know about, simply because if you get your view of the world from the news, it is bound to be biased in a negative direction. Now, part of that is an explicit bias that in the culture of journalism, partly because we all are engrossed by the negative. We watch murder mysteries and mafia films and ways in which violence is actually enacted for us. So there is a kind of gruesome, prurient interest in violence and disaster. Partly because journalists feel that they have to speak truth to power, and as one journalist put it to me, bad news is journalism, good news is advertising. So there is that bias. But even aside from all those biases and the search for, if it bleeds, it leads, and search for clicks and eyeballs, just anything that is driven by events is bound to be negative, because things that happen suddenly are almost always bad things. Good things either consist of things that don't happen, like a country is at peace, or a city hasn't been attacked by terrorists, or a country a country is well fed, there's no famine, or they creep up a few percentage points a year, sometimes compounding and transforming the world kind of stealthily, but it doesn't happen on a Thursday in October, so you never see it as a headline. As Max Roser, a statistician, put it, the papers could have had the headline, 137,000 people escaped from extreme poverty yesterday, every day for the last 30 years. But they never ran that headline, and so 1 billion people escaped from extreme poverty, and no one knows about it. And that's one of probably one of the most striking developments in our lifetime is the decline of extreme poverty. And it's big, massive effect. It's not a fluffy human interest story. This affects billions of people in a big way, and no one knows about it. So in presenting data like that, it sounds like, oh, isn't it nice you're an optimist? But I don't consider it being an optimist. It's just a fact that you're apt not to know about if you get your view of the world from the news. Now, this isn't a miracle. There's no force in the universe that just makes things better and better. Quite the contrary. The laws of nature don't care about us, and they kind of grind us down. There's entropy. Left to their own devices, things fall apart. There are many more ways in which the world can be disordered than ordered. There's evolution, that organisms evolve at each other's expense, and so we're constantly kind of sitting ducks for pathogens and parasites that can evolve a lot faster than we can. and that spoil and eat our food. There's the dark side of human nature. The natural course of events is for things to get worse or to stay bad. And my argument is so thinking almost as a scientist, like how do you explain this phenomenon that objectively speaking, a lot of things have gotten better? And I attribute it to, roughly speaking, the ideals of the Enlightenment. That is to say that if we get together, form institutions that bring out our rational side, if we set as our goal the enhancement of human welfare, that is, fewer people dying, that's good. Fewer people starving, fewer children dying, fewer mothers dying in childbirth. Let's try to help that along. Then, every once in a while we can succeed. We can figure out things that work. We can try not to repeat our mistakes. To the extent that we do that, that drives progress. But of course, we don't have to do it, and things can get worse.
Yeah, well, I think you make a point. They do get worse in addition to the cognitive biases of what news wants to report, there's just we live in a time, in a period. So, for example, World War I's being so close to World War II makes one think that, wow, we are really going, downward fast and irrevocably. But I think it's not just our biases in the present, but it's a very panoramic view, and you're starting with the savagery of kind of early caveman and a fossil that you describe of someone just violently killing others. So, it's the bigger sweep that it's not natural for us, instinctive for us to have that kind of long-range view. So much more. One follow-up, which is just the aspect of this of human rationality, and now we're on your most recent book, and so it's not simply a kind of the progress you said, but in particular about rationality, and you write, the arc of knowledge is a long one, and it bends toward rationality. Now, given what you just said, I don't think you take that to be a cosmological, God-given principle, but to argue it, and you do, you simultaneously acknowledge irrational, the real sort of stickiness of certain irrational beliefs, harmless ones, in part as you describe them, 32% of Americans, you point out, believe in ghosts. Not so harmless ones, people who are against vaccines or, were indifferent to COVID. But I think your point is, well, we can compartmentalize, and we do, the irrational and the rational. So I just, a quick question is, well, not a quick question, but maybe a quick answer is, how does that work exactly? How is it that certain kinds of irrational beliefs are sticky while others yield to reason, so the net effect is actually salutary and rational in the most important ways?
Yeah, so there's the paradox, or the tension, the frisson that drove my book Rationality.
Canada.
Was, on the one hand, obviously we're capable of great feats of rationality. We did invent vaccines, we got to the moon, we invented smartphones and proved theorems, dated the origins of life in the universe. But on the other hand, there's also QAnon, there's astrology, we're capable of all kinds of crazy stuff. So what is the interplay between our rational side and our kind of superstitious side? Part of it is that we all are rational when it comes to our everyday lives. I mean, we kind of have to be because, as they once said about the speed limit, it's not just a good idea, it's the law. And logic and math, you just can't get away from them. They govern reality. And so when it comes to keeping food on the table and a roof over your heads and gas in the car and the kids kind of clothed and fed, everyone's rational. I mean, or at least every sane person is rational. But when it comes to domains that just don't impinge on us every day, like why do bad things happen to good people? What really happens in the corridors of power? Where did the human species come from? What was the origin of the universe? It kind of doesn't really impinge on your everyday life. And until the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, no one knew. No one could know. And so myth was the best that you could do, so you may as well believe the most edifying, salubrious, feel-good myth, especially one that makes your tribe look good and the other tribe look bad. That's the natural human mindset, that outside the realm of concrete, immediate experience, myth is as good as anything else. Now, I as a scientist, as a professor, and all of us, I assume as kind of literate people, think, well, now you really can figure out a lot of these things. We have historians, and we have statisticians, and we have scientists, we have government record-keeping agencies, but these are institutions that were explicitly designed to work around our cognitive biases, our superstitions, and they're designed and sometimes work so that error can be identified and purged. Things like peer review in academia, empirical testing in science, fact-checking in journalism, editing, vetting, publishing errors in respectable newspapers, codes of ethics in journalism. They're all kind of working against our cognitive biases to try to be more rational collectively than any of us can be individually. Now, of course, when the institutions themselves obviously are fallible, they have to be. No one is kind of vouchsafed with the truth. None of us is an oracle. So the institutions will occasionally fail, will often fail. But when there's distrust in institutions and you fall back on your own intuitions, then people can believe all kinds of crazy stuff.
Yeah. Okay, boy, so much more here, but that we don't have time to do. But this, in fact, what you were just talking about builds in some ways on the work of Kahneman and Tversky. And but they, well, first, I think of them as being more of the view that we have inflexible, hard to get out of kinds of cognitive biases. But they also, of course, are very focused on happiness, which I don't think is a big part of your work. And I just wanted to ask you, you make this a strong empirical case that life's improving in so many ways, health, safety, life longevity, et cetera. Do you have a view as to whether that progress coincides with increases in human happiness?
Yeah, so it's, I have written about it, and I do try to track the happiness surveys like the World Happiness Report. So there's there's reason to believe that even though we don't have happiness surveys going back centuries, or in many places even decades, there's reason to believe that life satisfaction has improved, and that there's a very strong correlation between income and life satisfaction. That it's, of course, very nonlinear, because an extra $1,000 increases the happiness of a poor person a lot more than a rich person.
I mean, isn't it 75,000 or so, and then it kind of...
Well, it kind of, they're diminishing returns, but was it Wallace Simpson who said you can't be too rich or too thin? So there is something to that. I don't know if it actually literally flattens, but obviously it's got to bend over, because if you're a poor person, $1,000 changes your life. If you're a rich person, it doesn't. But it is. This is true within countries. That is, better off people are happier. It's true between countries. Richer countries are more satisfied with their lives. So as the world has gotten richer, which it has, you'd certainly expect people to get happier. And in surveys, a majority of countries have gotten happier over the last, say, 30 or 40 years. Although countries that are closer to the ceiling, like the United States, sometimes haven't. The United States has gotten a little less happy.
Yeah, the lacuna there of ones that are just below us being happy. There's obviously a much richer story, but I take your general point.
There are what they call first world problems.
Yeah, right, exactly.
And in terms of optimism and pessimism, there's an odd effect there, that it's often the direction of change rather than the level of change that determines how optimistic or pessimistic a country is. So the world's most pessimistic country is France. Now, France is a pretty pleasant place to live. And some of the more optimistic countries are like, Nigeria and China. Now, it's really much better to live in France than Nigeria.
Yeah.
And there is such a thing as kind of pocketing your gains and taking them for granted.
Yeah.
But there are a number of paradoxes in happiness, like why, in particular the United States, which is we kind of underperform compared to our affluence. We should be happier than we are.
Yeah, dramatically, I think, we're maybe not top 10 or whatever. Okay, so much more here, but this is a writer's conference, so I really wanted to ask you a couple questions about your elegant writer's manual, the sense of style. Let's start here. Writing, you point out there, begins with appreciating good prose. A recent article in The Atlantic reports that many students arrive at colleges, good colleges, basically never having read a full book. Yeah. They will not tolerate more than a 20-page little PDF section. You got to imagine, well, what's your sense of the state of the country's writing skills and whether the way we consume, if we do, literature, has affected it?
Yeah, it's a phenomenon at several levels. One of them is indeed just book length chunks of prose become less popular, even though there's an awful lot of text on the web. On the other hand, even on the web, there is, to my annoyance, a big shift from text to video and audio. So I, Google, my printer is stuck on, Windows, how do I unstick the printer queue? And the first 10 hits are YouTube videos. And it's like, I don't want to, sit through 3 minutes of a guy yammering. I just want to get the sentence or two on how to, so that's another phenomenon. There really is, we are kind of reverting a bit more in the direction of an auditory culture, auditory and visual. On the other hand, my understanding is, and there are probably maybe people in this festival who know the facts better than I, but publishing is doing okay, despite predictions of its demise. I mean, I think awful lot of books are being printed, and a lot of people buy them. But on the other hand, it is true that long reading seems to be in somewhat of a decline. Not.
Yeah. So you don't sound particularly troubled by it, and the kids today. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
Right.
it's another thing. Another case in which I try to step outside my own reactions, because my first reaction is the kids today.
Right.
But there's still a lot of text and there's a lot of reading.
All right. This is a really fun read for writers in particular, especially there's this 20-page section where you march through your sometimes very strong opinions on, burning questions of usage such as comprise, decimate, hopefully, fulsome. I take you to be what the linguists call a descriptivist, more, that is, you endorse more than the average, pundit in a paper anyway, even champion usage that the diction fuss budgets, abhor, but with a definite prescriptivist strain about where you yourself put your foot down in the correct way of certain phrases that shouldn't be misused and the like. I just want to know your basic way of thinking for how you cut that distinction between common but incorrect usage, which you'll often say is okay, versus certain points of this is impeccable and you can't go the way of the crowd. Do you have a sort of a general philosophy to your descriptivist, prescriptivist axis?
Yeah, absolutely. So this contrast of descriptivist versus prescriptivist goes back a long way, and it probably came to the fore in the 1960s when Webster's Third International Dictionary came out, and it had an entry for ain't. And now the thing is, ain't is a word. People use it. Now, of course, it is not standard. It is frowned on in formal prose. And any dictionary that is a resource for the English language has to acknowledge the fact, people use the word. The literary critic Dwight MacDonald, kind of the literary lion of his day, had an absolute tantrum. He wrote a screed in the, I think it was the New Yorker, on this was the first sign of the decline of Western civilization, and since then there's been a kind of a narrative that there are descriptivists who say the people, capital P, should be free to write however they please, and the prescriptivists, how you ought to write, who hold the line on standards, excellence, Western civilization. What I argue for in the book is, in the sense of style, I do have a discussion of that. The subtitle of the book is The Thinking Person's Guide to Writing in the 21st Century. And I argue is that this dichotomy actually makes no sense. And I speak with at least some authority. I was chair of the usage panel of the American Heritage Dictionary until Houghton Mifflin kind of pulled the plug on the dictionary. But the position is that there are conventions, there are standards for writing in forums like books, the New York Times, and so on, and that conventions are good. We couldn't understand each other unless there were certain rules for how a literate reader expects a literate writer to express themselves. To give an example, by the way, the singular they in the context of everyone returned to their seats, just to take one example, is a venerable and impeccable construction.
Required, you would say, really. I mean, for the
required.
absence of a generic pronoun in English, we have to go that way.
Yes.
I don't mean to interrupt, except you wrote, when this first came out, you were sort of in the vanguard, 60%. Now I think the they, for just that use, is universal virtually.
Yes, although it's different from, and here, the reason I call it the thinking person's guide is that the thing about these standards of what is correct and incorrect is you really should understand them. That first of all, a large number of them actually are bogus in the sense that if you go to dictionaries, if you go to usage guides, like the split infinitive, to boldly go where no man has gone before, there is a kind of a myth that this is ungrammatical. But you look at any dictionary, any usage guide, and they all say there's nothing wrong with the split infinitive. It's kind of folklore that everyone thinks that there is this rule, but there's no logic to it, there's no history to it, and a lot of the prescriptive rules, it's not that you should write however you please and blow off all the rules, it's that you should really have a sense of what the legitimate rules are and what is the folklore, mythology, bogus rules. And a lot of the rules really are bogus. Like you shouldn't say, hopefully it'll stop raining. There's nothing wrong with that, but there are kind of prissy, kind of grammar mavens who will say that that's a grammatical error, but they're wrong. It's not an error. Yeah. Also, the conventions change over time. We don't talk like people in Shakespeare's day or Chaucer's day, and there's nothing you can do about it. The language will change. Doesn't mean that every innovation should become part of the standard form of written English, but some things will change. So hopefully 100 years ago really did grate on everyone's ears. It was a neologism in its day, in the sense of the speaker's attitude as opposed to someone expressing a hopeful mindset. But it's become acceptable. No one decided. We don't have an academy of the English language. It's grassroots. The lunatics are running the asylum. What becomes, and in fact, I learned this when I joined the American Heritage Dictionary, when I asked the editor, how do you guys decide what goes in the dictionary? He said, well, we listen to the way people speak and write.
Which you think is actually a pretty logical way to do it.
Well, it's the only way, because it is not the case that rules of grammar are like laws of physics. They're to be discovered. They are only the expectations of a community of literate readers and writers. And so also, a lot of the choices of words and constructions depend very much on the purpose and the context. And good writers know this. So I'll take the case of ain't. So yeah, you don't use ain't in a news reporting in the New York Times or most books. There are contexts in which ain't is actually the first choice, such as if you're expressing some plain homespun truth that anyone with a lick of sense should know. like "it ain't necessarily so," or there was an erudite.
Is you is or is you ain't my baby?
Yes, right. So, in song lyrics, there's another thing where you got to sort of think about what language accomplishes. Many song lyrics, especially in popular music, use ain't because it's a monosyllable. It doesn't have that sibilant, and it just fits right much better in terms of the rhythm of the song. Likewise, if you're saying something like you're feigning a tone of exasperation, and you're saying something that just everyone ought to recognize, even if they've been denying it. Sometimes ain't, as in a colloquial sense, is perfectly legitimate. Just an example that I give is a very eminent philosopher, Hilary Putnam, said in a somewhat abstruse philosophical argument about meaning and logic. And he said, cut it any way you want, meanings just ain't in the head. This is in an academic journal, and he chose ain't for a reason. Namely, this is something that anyone thinking about it would have to conclude. So it's not a question you say, grammatical, incorrect, ungrammatical, correct, incorrect. For the particular purpose of that writer in that sentence, was it an appropriate choice given the level of formality that he was seeking, given the meaning that he wanted to express? And good writers know this, and experts on usage know this. And so one of the best ways of determining whether something is correct or incorrect is just look at guides to usage. And in fact, they will all say there's nothing wrong with the split infinitive. Ain't has certain uses in certain contexts. Dangling participles are okay in this context, but not in that context.
Although there still will be some very contentious disputes. I felt continually deflated and exposed as like a pompous prig, to my family's delight, by the way. I think of myself as sort of a stickler for certain points of usage. I feel seizures coming on with the proliferating use of fulsome among my peers in the commentariat. But my podcast has this, I think now pedantic and silly, final tag of we have to answer a question in 5 words or fewer. And there are many ways in which
with 5 words or less.
I felt deflated. Maybe we'll tell could we make
fulsome,
that
by
change?
the way, people use fulsome to mean full, plentiful,
full body,
abundant. The finer meaning is insincerely
Oleaginous, right? Really suck-uppy, yeah.
But it's doomed, just because it's when you have a word whose etymology and components just scream one meaning, and it's not the correct meaning. It's just it's an uphill battle. But I agree with you.
Yeah, right.
I agree with you, and I use sometimes fulsome in its narrower sense.
Yeah. But here's one that I really feel. I think a lot of people in the audience, sophisticated people, whatever, are. I realized when I was reading, I have a dilemma kind of once or twice a week. You talk a lot about the plasticity of adjectives and adverbs, and hopefully being a good example. So here's a perennial simple one, but people get tangled up in it, and I get tangled up in it. Hi, Stephen. Hope you're well. Hi, Stephen. Hope you're good. Do you have an opinion on this
Yes.
Question of world importance?
Yeah, I hope you're good. There's nothing wrong with it.
No, so both, they're equally impeccable.
They're equally impeccable. And again, this is not the kind of anarchic, descriptivist, do your own thing, rules are old-fashioned. It's just that the rule that says you can't say I'm good is wrong.
Yeah.
It's just not a rule. It doesn't follow. It is not consistent with the history of the word, with the logic of the construction.
We should all relax.
We should, in that case, it's not so much we should all relax. We should all relax. But the argument there is, even if you don't relax, even if you actually analyze the usage, the history, the practice of English's best writers, that often tells you that the sticklers' rule is just not a rule. The sticklers are wrong. Yeah. So it's not a relaxing of standards.
Pompous prigs and fuss budgets.
Yeah, it's actually raising standards, not lowering standards, in that if you were to look at the history of usage, if you look at the practice of best writers, if you look at the logic of grammar, then you see that the sticklers are just wrong. They're the ones that have the sloppy standards because they are kind of imposing some obsolete superstition about the language. And this is not relaxing the rules, this is applying a higher standard.
Okay, I just want to announce, because Debbie is a very big stickler, at 0, Karl Rove got the plug pulled, and I want to, it's true, I want to leave 90 seconds for you to tell us about your next book, meaning please try to make this one compact.
Yes.
But I really did, as I said at the outset, you're also a very important thinker about current events. And we'll leave the president aside to talk about, you co-founded the Council on Academic Freedom at Harvard to promote free speech and inquiry. It's a balance that universities seem to have really botched in recent years, spectacularly. So just what are the basic operating principles that you think ought to guide universities attempting to balance academic freedom with tenets of equal respect for all members of the community?
Yeah, so the Council on Academic Freedom is devoted to free speech, intellectual diversity, and civil discourse. And there are reasons to think that those have been under threat at universities. It doesn't, one of the issues we constantly face is, so does that mean that it's okay to barge into classrooms with bullhorns and deliver a tirade against Israel, or to occupy the campus? And the answer is, at least the answer that we argue is, as with First Amendment jurisprudence, and the United States is more protective of free speech than any other democracy, but there are reasoned limits. You have to have a reason to repress speech. Sometimes there are. And so, no, drowning out a speaker with bullhorns is impinging on the speaker's right and the audience's right to hear him. So, no, that is not protected. Or, libel, sexual harassment, incitement to imminent violence.
Assault.
Extortion. All of those are cases where you really do draw the line. So rather than just be kind of knee-jerk defense lawyers for anyone saying anything, we try to draw defensible lines. And that's been one of our biggest challenges, because some of my colleagues just say, well, we should always be on the side of anyone saying anything anywhere whenever they wanted.
That the last year seemed so benighted in general, and I have a vague sense, a couple kids in college, that it's getting maybe 5% better. All right, you are scheduled next to publish When Everyone Knows That Everyone Knows, Common Knowledge and the Mysteries of Money, Power, and Everyday Life, I think in September. Can you tell us a little bit about it and maybe how it fits in with your other works?
Yeah, so common knowledge has a technical meaning in philosophy and economics and game theory, which is, I know something, you know it, I know that you know it, you know that I know it, I know that you know that I know that you know it, ad infinitum, which sounds like an impossible thought to think, but I argue that we actually think it all the time. Whenever we have a sense that something is out there or public or you can't miss it, and it is significant because it is necessary for coordination, that is, people being on the same page. It's not enough, if we want a rendezvous, it's not enough that I know where we're going to go or that you know that where we're going to go. I have to know that you know that I know. Otherwise, each of us could outguess the other and go to the other place. So a lot of our rituals, a lot of our hypocrisy, a lot of our concern with privacy, a lot of our euphemism, a lot of depend on the presence or absence of common knowledge in this technical sense, as opposed to private knowledge. A lot of financial phenomena hinge on it. I'll just give one example. A bank run consists of a kind of common knowledge, namely people withdraw their money not because they think there's anything wrong with the bank, but because they think that other people might think that other people might think that other people might think that other people, and that then creates the very reality that was originally in people's minds. So there's a lot of phenomena that kind of known for a long time in academia and in certain sectors. Economists know about it, logicians know about it, but it's such an important idea that I thought it should be out there, as we say. It should become common knowledge should become common knowledge.
Please join me in thanking the great Steven Pinker.